What's up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. This week's episode is 5 tips for success in Aetherdrift Limited. So I get the feeling, I get the vibe that it's been a really tricky format for a lot of people. A lot of people coming to my Twitch chat this week just straight up being like, Alex, I am floundering this format. You know, I'm 1-3ing all over the place. Please help me not 1-3. Please just give me some tips. Give me some quick hits of advice that will help me in my drafts. And so I figured, what better way to spend this episode than just do exactly that. So I've got 5 things that I think if you can implement these things, I think you are going to see an improvement in your win rate. This episode is going to be a little bit shorter than usual, a little bit more punchy. I'm not feeling my best. I'll spare you the gory details, but let's just say I was sleeping next to the bathroom for much of last night, and I almost considered not doing an episode this week, but I figured, I could muster up enough strength to do a little bit of a short one. So, gonna be pretty punchy, just gonna be the 5 tips, and yeah, let's just get into it. So my first tip for success is splash, splash, and splash some more, and if you're already somebody who's splashing a lot in this format, probably splash even more than that. I think this format is just super kind to splashing. It's both pretty slow, so you can get your mana under you. You don't have to worry about getting run over when you're playing tap lands or mana rocks. It's got an abundance of fixing. It's got a lot of powerful cards that you might want to splash. I was going through my trophy decks before I hopped on to record, and I think all but one of them is splashing. 1, 2, or 3 colors. I've had quite a few 5-color decks. I've also got in front of me here Just Lolaman's 17 lands page. He posted this on Twitter. And if you don't know Just Lolaman, fantastic drafter. He's on like a generational tear right now with this format. His win rate in best of 1 is just absurd. It's like the 76 win rate he posted here. And that's just like unheard of for best of 1. Like a sustained 76 win rate after 2 weeks. Hats off to him. But he's noted the same thing. Like he said on Twitter too, like most of my decks I'm splashing in. I think right now a lot of people are sort of in a 2-color mindset for this set because, there's nothing explicit about the set that says splash, splash, splash. The last set that was kind of this splash friendly in recent memory was Dominaria United, and that set said, yeah, you should splash. There's the domain mechanic that said, yeah, you want to play a bunch of colors. There's nothing explicit really that says you should play a bunch of colors, but I don't think there's a good reason not to play a bunch of colors, right? Like, you just don't get run over all that often. Like I said, the fixing's really good, so I just think that I'm not really trying to get necessarily into a color pair in this format. I mean, sure, you're going to try to focus in on 2 colors as some sort of base, but not necessarily as like, oh, I'm the red-green exhaust deck, right? I'm more like I'm a red-green deck, I have some exhaust cards, and I may be splashing 2 colors. Or maybe you're a Dimir artifact deck that is splashing some red cards, right? Some like red removal. Basically what I'm saying is I think splashing should be your default, because if you're not splashing, you're not often going to have enough power in your deck. A lot of the 2-color decks I've seen in this format, if you were to put them in any other draft format, I'd be like, yeah, you know what, that's a pretty solid deck, there's something wrong with that. But in this format, when other people are going to be splashing a lot and their decks are going to be more powerful, if you're not also kind of, stepping up the arms race there, you're going to fall behind draft in, draft out. So I just want to go over some of my preferred splashing tools, and I take these cards pretty highly. I mean, highly is relative, but I would say that all the cards I'm about to talk about, I take, a pick or 2 higher than the average player, maybe even more than that in some cases. And one that I've been, just coming up and up and up, and I talked about this card when I did my vehicle tier list earlier on YouTube, if you didn't catch that, is Veloheart Bike. This is the 3-mana vehicle. It's a 4/2 crew 2, taps to add a mana of any color. When it enters, you gain 2 life. I've been averaging like 1.5 Veloheart Bikes in my green decks, and I think there's just a lot to like here, right? It's a 5-color mana rock. It doesn't lock you in like some fixers tend to do, just being able to produce any color of mana as the game goes on, meaning that in the draft, you can pick this up and be like, okay, well, I can splash any card now, or be, well on my way to splashing any card. The gain 2 is a really nice life buffer when you're not affecting the board when you cast this, or just being able to be like, all right, well, even though you're not getting run over very often in this format, it is still nice to just go up a little bit of life. The vehicle is relevant for attacking and blocking. Like, your opponents don't really want to attack like their Hazard of the Dunes into this thing when you've just got a 2/2 lying around. So yeah, I just really want to sing the praises of this card. I really, really like it. I think that it's very underrated right now. And I'm not saying you have to 3rd, 4th pick this or anything, but if I start green and I see like a 6th pick bike and there's nothing too exciting to pack, I'm just like, slam this, because it just opens up all the possibilities in the world for the future of the draft. A similar card that I like a lot is Starting Column, the 3-mana artifact that has Start Your Engines. It taps to add a mana of any color, and you can sack it when you have max speed to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. I like this card a little bit less than Bike, and I like it mostly in the non-green decks, because I think a big part of this card is the max speed part of it. And, I like it in like Esper. I like it in Grixis kind of decks. The reason being that I think those decks are just a little bit more conducive to getting to max speed. You've got Drain from Packdoll Terrors, and you've got cheap, Thopters running around, maybe, 1/3 flyers. So it's just pretty easy to get to that max speed, cash in the Mana Rock after you've used it. Kind of the same as Veloheart Bike, where if I see this card, 7th, 8th, and there's nothing exciting in the pack, I'm like, yeah, slam this. This is really just going to help me, jam more power into my deck, which is really what you're looking for in this format. You're really just looking for as much power as you can. Almost sort of like a sealed mindset, I would say, where the number one priority in this format for me is just like, can I get power in my deck? Can I get the best cards that I see in the draft in my deck? Another great one, and this is a stronger card than the last two I talked about. And I'm actually pretty surprised this card goes as late as it does. I see this one like 6th, 7th pick sometimes. Mole Tender. This is the single green mana 1/1. Tap it to mill a card and tap it to exile a card from your graveyard. Add a mana of any color. Yeah, once again, 5-color fixer. This one ramps you. You can often cast like a really good 5-drop ahead of schedule. Maybe people see this as like a black-green exclusive card, but I don't see it as that at all. I think you can just play it in any green deck and it's going to be pretty good. It does get a little bit better in green-black where, you don't have to be like, all right, mill a card and then next turn exile a card and then mill a card. You're going to naturally fill the graveyard. But even in a deck where you don't have self-mill, cards trade off, you cast removal spells, you cast draw spells, cards go to the graveyard in a game of Magic, right? So that second ability is going to be turned on pretty often. And you've got your lands, of course, the tap dual lands that gain you a life, your Night Market. These are cards that I like to speculate on in the middle of the pack, just like the bike, just like the column. When there's nothing else exciting, sure, take a land, speculate. One that I talked about last week, but I've liked even more and more as I played it, is Marshall's Path Cruiser. This is the 3-mana uncommon Crew 5 vehicle. Then when it enters, you search for a basic. It's a 6/5 vehicle. You can also exhaust it for Wooburg mana to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Yeah, I think the thing that I missed about this card when I read it the first time is that just, you can just beat down with it or block with it without having to exhaust it, right? Think like, okay, Crew 5's a lot, but if you just have a 2/2 on the battlefield, you play this thing, maybe you play something with 3 power, 4 power on turn 4, this thing just bashes for 6. Or if you're on the defense, maybe you're on the draw, you keep it back, it's a 6/5 on blocks. The vehicle is relevant very early, much earlier in the game than you might expect. And yeah, you don't have to exhaust it for the vehicle to become relevant. So I just love Path Cruiser. I take this card really highly, kind of in the Molt Tender territory, where if I see it, I'm like, yeah, let's just take this. Another card that I think goes a little bit too late. And then sometimes, you're a little bit desperate and you'll play a Ticket Tortoise. This is the 2-mana 3/1 defender that if your opponent has more lands than you make a treasure token. Just like Starting Column, I like this more in the non-green decks. So your artifact decks, this makes 2 artifacts, which is sometimes relevant. So not my preferred choice of fixing. Sometimes you draw it and you're just like, oh, this is just a 3/1 defender. I don't really want it. But it definitely gets the job done if you just need to hold the mana together, need another cheap card, want an artifact. So yeah, I think the stamp I would put on this is, in most formats, your default should be find a 2-color pair, and maybe you splash in that 2-color pair, but most of the time you're just 2 colors. I think, at least for me, the way I've been drafting, it's the opposite. I'm assuming I'm going to be multiple colors. And then if my lane is really open, you're just like, wow, nobody's in blue-black. Okay, sure, I'll be a 2-color deck because I got amazing cards in 2 colors. So yeah, embrace the multicolor mindset. Still splash responsibly. You want to make sure you got your sources in there, do a source count, break out the hypergeometric calculator if you need to, or the Frank Carson article if you need to. But yeah, when done responsibly, I think this is like the number one thing that if you're not doing will improve your drafts. All right, tip number 2 here is follow the recipe for success of what a good deck looks like in this format. The Alex patented recipe for success. So whenever I'm learning a format, and after I've played it for like a week or two, I start to build a picture of what does a good draft deck look like in this format? What are the things it has? What does this format ask of me to include in my deck to be successful, to be functional? And in a lot of formats, typically it's make sure you've got a lot of cheap cards. This one, that's not part of the recipe necessarily in this one. And in this format, I think the recipe is actually pretty simple. It's 1, removal spells. That's an easy one. But 2, make sure that all your cards that aren't removal spells help you spend mana as the game goes on. Help you use your lands, making sure that you're spending all of your mana every turn. You're not just staring at your opponent as they spend all their mana every turn. You're hoping to top deck a good card. If you go down the top cards on 17 lands, like the top commons and uncommons, the theme that they have are all exactly that. They help you spend mana. They're exhaust creatures. They're expensive creatures. They are, stuff like Grim Bauble, the single black mana, -2/-2 artifact, has the ability to sacrifice it for 3 mana to Surveil 2. That's spending mana, digging you to action. Like, everything on that list, save for like a card or two for the top 20 cards, falls into that camp of either a removal spell or something that will help you spend mana as you get to turn 5, 6, 7, 8. This is exhaust creatures, of course. That's another thing. Thunderhead Gunner. That's another thing, too. Just being able to pitch your lands, find action. I think that's a big part of why the Sultai colors are so good in this format, because they help you do that, right? For the exhaust mechanic, through just expensive things. And I think largely that's why white's not good in this format. It's just that, it's not even that the cards are like so underrated compared to the other cards. It's just that when you go in the list of the white commons and uncommons, they don't help you spend mana as the game goes on. They just kind of sit there. And maybe they're an okay body, but you'll get stalled out very, very easily. So you just want to make sure that you're not that player that's just sitting there, right? You want to make sure that you are churning through your deck. And again, this is something I talked about last week, but I really want to hammer it home, because I think if you go through your deck list at the end and you're trying to figure out, how should I build my deck, your instincts might tell you, play a nice curve, right? Just like play that staircase looking curve. And there's nothing against a good curve, right? If your good curve includes 2-drops that will help you spend mana as the game goes on. A great example of this, a card that I've been taking higher and higher as the weeks, a good example of this, a card I've been taking higher and higher as the days have gone on, is the 2-mana 2/2 in green. That you can pay 5 to look at the top 3 cards of your library, take a non-land permanent. Like, that card is just skyrocketed in my pick order. I take it as one of the top green commons. I mean, there's a lot of green commons that are good, but that's one of the better ones, because it's a 2 that can trade on 2 if you do fall a little bit behind, but then just sits there and just turns through your deck. It really makes it so that you're the one that will be advantaged in that kind of board stall situation. So yeah, sorry, I got a little bit off topic there, but the point being that, there's nothing wrong with the Gerd curve, but don't try to make, an aesthetically nice curve just for the purposes of having an aesthetically nice curve, if that aesthetically nice curve comes at the cost of playing a bunch of cheap cards that just don't do anything after turn 4, turn 5. You really want to make sure your cheap cards continue to do something as the game goes on, and you also probably want to include more expensive cards than you're used to in most formats. And often when I'm describing new formats, I go, okay, well, this deck wants this, and this deck wants that. But I think this idea kind of transcends color pairs in this format, honestly. You'll mostly think of the Sultai color pairs when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to be spending mana in the late game. But, black-white, for example, I think does a pretty good job of it, or can do a pretty good job of it. I had a black-white deck here that I drafted yesterday that, if you just look at all the cards, they're doing exactly that. They either, we've got Wreckage Wicker Folks, for example, that's a good card. Just a 2-mana 1/3 flyer that surveils 2 when it enters. That helps you dig through lands. We've got the cycle of Surveyor commons, Leonin Surveyor, and Mutant Surveyor. These are the ones that you can exile from your grave to draw a card when you get max speed. These are fine cards to fill out the curve. I've got Deathless Pilot, which is the 2-mana 2/2 that you can return from your graveyard to your hand. And this deck went 4/3. So, decent showing, not too bad, not too great. But I think what it was really missing was even more ways to spend its mana, which I know sounds a little bit strange. But I found I did get into the situation in this deck where I kind of was just sitting around a little bit too often, not spending my mana. I wish that when I drafted it, I had maybe thought about drafting another color with it, right? Drafting blue for some card draw, picking up some of those good, blue artifacts that help you grind, like the 6-mana Azorius one, the big vehicle that tutors an artifact when it comes in. That would have been a pretty good splash in this deck, I think. I've seen some successful red-white decks even implement this, right? So if you are drafting and you're like, wow, red-white's just super open, I think you can draft red-white, but just don't draft it in the typical red-white mindset of, oh, I'm going to be attacking and, this is an aggressive deck. Draft it as, okay, well, here's some removal spells, and all of my creatures and all my other spells, I just want to make sure that they help me spend mana as the game goes on, right? Give me a mana sink. Give me, some filtering of some sort. So yeah, I say it's a recipe for success because it doesn't really matter too much, I think, what your color pair is. If you're any sort of slower deck, and there are aggressive decks in this format, we're going to get to that in a second, that I think are viable. But if you're any sort of deck that you don't think you're going to try to end the game before a Ketrodon comes down, before the 6-mana 6/6 gain 4, if that's not your plan, if you're planning to contend with the Ketrodons, you're trying to go toe-to-toe with them, you just want to make sure almost all your cards are, just removal spells or cards that help you spend your mana. It sounds like an oversimplification, and it is to some degree. I think there's some nuance there, of course. I'm kind of glossing over the nuance a little bit. But if you reduced your deck building choices to just cards that did those two things, removed things, and helped you spend mana, I think your decks are going to be a lot better than they were before. My next tip is sort of a meta thought, and that's don't give up on drafting green too early. So this is the closest I think I've come almost ever to forcing a color after people know it's good. Like, often what happens is I'll identify early on, okay, this is the best color, these two colors are pretty good, and, I'm getting my money's worth of drafting those colors for the first few days, and then people find out, right? They're like, okay, you'll have 3 people, 4 people at your table being like, hey, black in this format is really, really good, so I want to draft that color. And, I think for this format, green is that color by far, for sure. There's just so many good commons, so many good uncommons, so many good rares, too. And people know, definitely the secret is out that green is good. But I think it's so good and so deep that I don't think you should give up on it, even if you feel like you're getting a little bit cut out. Basically, my logic here is that if you can just fit in 8, 9, 10 green cards, like even if green isn't that open, but if you can get that handful of, a few solid uncommons, a few of the good commons, your deck is still going to be really good. And here's the other thing to note is that I find what happens is that in pack 1, everybody's scrambling for green, because they want to start in green. And a lot of people will get scared, right? They'll lose the game of chicken. They'll be like, all right, I'll back off. I'll draft something else. And then it opens back up in pack 2 and pack 3. So especially if you've got a good reason to be green. Now, you've got good rares, good uncommons. If you've first, second, third picked Ketradons, Migrating Ketradon, the 6-mana 6/6, which, by the way, kind of funny to say, I think this card's actually kind of underrated. Like, I think this is the best common in the format. I will play, 3, 4 of them, and I'm still seeing them 5th, 6th pick, which I think is kind of late. Like, I see this on par as, like, a really good uncommon, basically. I think you should take Ketradon and Stampeding Scurryfoot, for what it's worth. The 1-mana, 1/1, exhaust, 4-mana, make a 3/3, put a counter on it. Like, these two cards, I see them as, like, basically the level of a premium uncommon. And so if you have those, or a good rare, or a bunch of good uncommons, and you see green drawing up, your instinct might be like, oh, it's not open, I'll just move out of it. But my advice is just hang on, Of course, if you're at a table with everybody taking this advice, it's not going to work out. You're going to want to draft something else, so still be aware, but fight against those instincts a little bit of like, I'm not seeing green cards, maybe we should move out of it. If you finish pack 1 with 5 good green cards, you can probably pick up, 2 or 3 good green cards in pack 2 or 3, and then just pair it with another open color. So, I've heard advice from other people saying like, like everybody's in green these days. You want to be, maybe Grixis or something else. I think that's the take on Lords Unlimited this week. Ben and Ethan were saying like, oh yeah, they really like being in Grixis. And, different things are going to work for different players. But I found like the opposite. Like, I'm not trying to zig when people are zagging. I'm trying to be like, all right, like everybody knows green is good. And that actually works to my advantage because people try to get into the color, then back off of it when everybody tries to get in. So yeah, green's good. Green's great. I think it is the strongest a color has been in a very long time. So I want to take advantage of that. I want to play green cards if I can. And the really nice thing, here's the cherry on top, is that because green allows you to play other colors, it means that you're not going to be missing out on playables if green is fairly cut, right? If you can lock in your 8, 9, 10 green cards, then pick up a bit of fixing, you can fill the rest of your deck out with cards of other colors, maybe 2 or 3 colors, and you're still going to have a very good deck, as long as, going back to the last tip, you're following the recipe of just making sure that you've got a good amount of removal and enough cards that play well as the game goes on. Tip number 4 is do draft the good aggressive decks when they're open. And these are black-red and green-white. I think these are the 2 good aggressive decks in the format. They do a really good job of pressuring the decks that I've been talking about for the rest of the episode, right? The multicolor decks I like to play are the bigger green decks. They tend to play that same role as you might expect from a good limited deck. I think they pressure them well enough and in the right ways. Like the way you might expect a good red-white deck in another format to be, like, the boogeyman of the format. I think that red-black and green-white kind of play that boogeyman role. In most matchups in this format, I don't feel bad if I don't play something on 2, but if I'm facing one of these decks, yeah, I have to make sure I have a 2, or else you do tend to get run over. I tend to get pulled into these decks because of the gold cards, which is no surprise, of course. Like, the gold cards are the rewards, the reasons to get into these decks, but I think they're really strong across the board for both the Rakdos deck and the Selesnya deck. Like, we've got 2 good rares. Both decks get pretty good rares. Far Fortune for the Rakdos deck and Caradora for the Selesnya one. Far Fortune's the 4-mana 4/5 that pings your opponent whenever you attack, and if you've got max speed, it deals, all your sources deal that much damage +1. Caradora is the 4-mana 4/2 that searches out a mount or a vehicle. And then if a +1/+1 counter would be put on something you control, you put that much +1. Like, 2 great rares. And then they also, both these decks get 2 phenomenal uncommons, like some of the best uncommons in the set. Gastel Thrillseeker for Rakdos and Veteran Beast Rider for Selesnya. I like Apocalypse Runner and Lagarin just fine. Those are the other 2 gold commons. But really the stars of the show here are the rares and the Gastel Thrillseeker and Veteran Beast Rider. Like, these 2 cards, like, if I get a 3rd pick, 4th pick Beast Rider, I'm going to take that 1 because, you know, I think it's a fine splash in the multicolor decks. But 2, this is a good reason to draft like a straight up 2-color deck, just beat down. Like, this thing pressures so well. Thrillseeker, kind of the same story. If you do find yourself drafting these decks, I think the recipe for success of a good deck changes a little bit. You still want the removal spells, you know, a good healthy handful of removal spells is still good. But I would replace the ways to spend mana as the game goes on with ways to keep attacking. Because I think you need to be attacking every single turn of the game. Like, you need to be attacking on, you know, ideally 2, but then 3, 4, 5. Like, if your opponent ever bricks your creatures, I think you have a really tough time winning that game, which is just, you know, kind of the story of the format. Aggressive decks are already kind of trying to punch up, right? They're already a little bit disadvantaged. But in a lot of formats, when I'm playing an aggressive deck, the general game plan is, okay, you try to get in the first 10, 12 points. You know, ideally you kill them right away. But if you get to turn 6 and you haven't killed them, maybe they're at 7. They're not exactly stable, and you maybe draw a flyer or a mass pump spell or just some way to push the last few points of damage. And it's not that bad to kind of wait around at like turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, as long as the opponent's not killing you back immediately. Usually your aggressive deck doesn't mind chilling out for a few turns once it's already dealt the first, you know, 15-ish points and just trying to draw that way to push the last few. I think that's not the case in this format. I think that once you get to turn 6, the chances of winning the game as the aggressive deck just drop dramatically. Because when your opponent plays that first Ketradon, yeah, that's a really big problem, right? Just gain 4, blocks everything. They're probably going to cast the other one or, you know, gain some life some other way. So there's a lot of pressure to just make sure that your creatures consistently continue to get in. So how are you doing that? Well, I think the combat tricks in this format are really strong. I would recommend playing multiple copies of them. Like, I played 5, 6 copies of the good tricks. So just to kind of run down the good tricks I'm talking about. Maximum Overdrive. This is the perfect card for the Rakdos deck, exactly what you want. You'll play 4 copies of it if you have the non-creature slots. This is the 2-mana instant that puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains Death Touch and indestructible. So not only will you win the combat, but your creature is a little bit bigger the next turn. A very similar card for the green decks is Silken Strength, the 2-mana aura. It's got Flash. The enchanted creature gets +1/+2. You untap it. It gains Reach. You can enchant a vehicle for what it's worth. And then also Bestow Greatness. This is the 3-mana instant +4/+4 and trample trick. This card is awesome. Just pushes so much damage. I've had a lot of games where I just went, 2 into 3, and I had 3 Bestow Greatnesses in my hand, and it's went like, okay, cast 1, and then next turn cast another. Next turn, cast another. I guess you're just dead. So yeah, I do think you have to proceed with caution with these aggro decks. I think you have to draft them only when they're open. Even if you first pick that 4 Fortune, don't just force it and be like, blinders on, I've got this awesome rare. You do need to make sure that you're getting more good red and black cards. You're getting the good uncommons and such. But I do think in a lot of seats, it is right to be drafting those 2-color decks, those 2-color aggro decks, and do play an abundance of these tricks. Like I said, I don't mind playing 4, 5, like these 3 here, Maximum Overdrive, Silken Strength, Bestow Greatness. Like, I wouldn't mind playing 4 or 5 of them in my deck. Sometimes tricks are like, well, maybe I'll play a copy or 2, but no, I think you really want to load up on them. I think they actually play the role of pushing damage better than removal in a lot of cases in the set, because with removal, what happens is you cast a removal spell on their blocker, they then crew in response, and they can still block, right? You don't get that effect with these tricks, especially something like Bestow Greatness that will still push a bunch of damage even if they block. And my final tip for this format is check out the Patreon, patreon.com/no, I do have a real tip, but do check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups if you're enjoying the show, if you like the content. We're a crowdfunded show here, really helps keep the lights on, so go check it out. There's a bunch of rewards over there, help you get better at Limited Magic. There's a link in the description of the YouTube video and the podcast feed, so check that out. But yeah, the actual tip here, tip number 5, is a gameplay tip. And that's, once you get to turn 4 or turn 5, you really should think, how is this game going to progress? And I know this is a skill that's pretty difficult for a lot of players, just thinking multiple turns in advance. You know, Magic's a very complex game. Lots of the time, you're just focused on what's happening, the here and the now. But because the games tend to meander on, because the games sometimes do go to turn 22. I just played a game earlier today where it was a 22 turn game, and I won with only a few cards in my library. You do want to make sure you know as the game goes on, do I have tools in my deck to keep grinding? Like, how many big things do I have? Do I have 3 Ketradons coming? Okay, well then maybe I'm fine trading off this one with their Ketradon because I have more big things coming. Do I have a good rare that can close out the game? Or do I have a good rare that'll help me, draw a bunch of cards and outcard the opponent? How important is this Thunderhead Gunner, right? Do I want to run it out right now on 5 to maybe block a little bit of aggression? Or should I hold it till later so that, I can keep it so I can filter through my lands because, I don't have much action in hand, and instead of playing the Gunner on 5, which might expose it to a removal spell, I'll play a 2 and a 3 to try and block instead. And then maybe the opponent uses the removal spell there, and then I can play the Gunner after. It survives. I'll keep going on, right? It's all those kind of decisions. And this is going to lead into a future episode. The gameplay in this format I've actually found to be really, really exciting, really fun. And so we're definitely going to do a gameplay episode for this. But just something to think about, right? If you're not already thinking about it, if you're a player who's more focused on turn 2, 3, 4, the curve out, and what you're trying to do there, I would just put a little bit of effort to thinking okay, what's in my deck? What is my opponent's strategy? Do they have a bunch of cards in hand? Whose advantage as the game goes on is a good distinction to make. Make that evaluation, and then you can make some better plays as you go on with that information. Anyways, I hope this helped. Again, apologies for the kind of shorter, more brief episode. Hope it was still helpful. And yeah, we'll be back next week for our regularly scheduled program. If you made it this far, do like, comment, subscribe, all of the stuff. We'll see you next time, everybody.